also not what looks okay at this time. Remember I mentioned this characteristic response time that we're talking about. There's some of these things, as an example, we could make a life's choice which doesn't work its way through our generational line until our grandchildren or great-grandchildren, when the choice we make in our lives, all of a sudden, at that point, it shows up to be, we blew it. But we won't even be around to realize that we blew it. So that when you make some of these choices, you have to take into account not just the influence that it has on you at the moment, but also the influence that it will have on the lives of your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And as a matter of fact, in the biblical term, the sins of the fathers go how long, Reverend?
Third and fourth generation.
Isn't that interesting?
Exodus 20.
Isn't that interesting? So what it teaches us is that from prehistoric times, if you will, this was recognized that this continuity from generation to generation is something we have to be cognizant of. It's not just what makes me feel good now. That's just the surface, just the surface.
Like the Native Americans, why they would only leave the first 7 plants, pick the 8th one. That way the continuity was there for the 7 generations, and they wouldn't like wipe out the whole crop so that nothing would go back again.
Okay, next
Quick
slide.
question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So your contention is that maybe society is using those
That's right.
things to determine ethics.
Yeah, these are the pop terms.
The superficial things.
That's it.
Rather than getting deeper
That's right.
into what ethical behavior really means.
Exactly. And the idea of this relying on the testing, the screening of your ancestral lineage, and that set of values that you inherit from them are actually, as an evolutionary process, withstanding a natural selection process. Because what nature does is, if the value doesn't support survival or enhance survival, those who practice that value won't survive, and that value, that bad value, is selected out by nature as a mutation, if you will. And it's a natural process. And it's a very important natural process. So we can choose, we have every right to choose whatever we want to do with ourselves. That's perfectly within our right. And I wouldn't want to take that away from anybody. And as a matter of fact, what you may consider to be right from the standpoint of your ethical values that you inherited, and what you may have as what you think is right from your ethical values, it's perfectly okay for the two of you to be looking at the same choice differently. Because each of you has a right to use their ancestral lineage, inheritance, as the basis for the choices they make in their lives. And that's why I wouldn't say that one is more correct than the other. I may consider yours correct and hers wrong, or I may consider hers correct and yours wrong based on my own understanding of ethical values. But the obligation that we should resort to is placing great faith on the value, the authority of the ethical value system that we inherit from our ancestors. Again, resorting to the Bible, look at the commandment of honor thy father and thy mother. Now, most people think that you're supposed to honor your father and your mother because they sacrificed for you, they fed you, they did all kinds of wonderful things for you, right? That's not what it says.
But they did.
Of course. But that's not what the Bible says. Of all of the 10 Commandments, there's only one that gives a reason why you should obey that commandment.
The days of your life
promise.
should be long.
So that your years on this land will be extended.
So that what?
so that your years on this land will be extended.
Will be accepted?
Survival, extended.
Extended.
Survival. What the Bible is doing with that commandment is saying that the interrelationship between parent and child is one where the survival of the child over a long period of time, not just growing up through childhood, but for the rest of their lives, is very intimately linked with the relationship with the parents. Because that's where what the child needs to learn to survive comes from. Now, can you imagine if somehow we were able to get the public school systems in the United States to take on the challenge of teaching that relationship between parent and child to all the children of this generation in public schools?
Make a difference.
Can you imagine what would be accomplished if all of the children that are growing up in schools today would understand what their role is in terms of the lives of their children that they're going to raise? I think it's a tragedy that somehow we aren't able to get that into the public school education curriculum. I happen to feel that that's something we should take on as a challenge, to try to get that message across, that when a child gets an education in any kind of a school, they should learn what expected relationship is between parent and child, and why. And I have to tell you that that's basically the focus of this entire presentation. That relationship between parent and child, and it's important, when you read the text, you think it's a statement just to the child. The truth is, it's much more than that, because by linking the survival of the child to the parent so directly, what is being stated there to the parents also is you have to make that possible, and you have to fulfill that obligation too. It's a two-way thing, actually. Okay, next slide, please.
I was just trying to add one thing. Just as an added commentary, it makes for living peaceably with your neighbor and nation. It enhances that opportunity. Not only extends your life, but extends the life of nations.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you have a society which doesn't encourage its children to do that, and doesn't encourage its parents to fulfill their responsibilities, you have a lot of suffering. You have a tremendous amount of suffering. So, while law enforcement, as we say, plays a very big role in the circumstances when we as parents fail to do what we're supposed to do, we have to recognize that that initial burden is ours as parents. And the whole idea, by the way, of the text saying that honor your father and your mother, it doesn't even necessarily say obey. It says honor. And that's a whole other discussion from an ethical standpoint, but it's a very important consideration. Okay. I mentioned before this natural selection process, that good survives, bad does not by definition. We've defined it that way. We say whatever encourages survival, we define as good. Whatever undermines survival, we define as bad. Even if it makes us feel good. If it undermines our survival in the long run, or not only our survival, by the way, as we mentioned before, that remember, response time could be multi-generational. So we have to take that into account too. The idea that we can make a life choice, a personal life choice, which legally we're entitled to do, which could put succeeding generations at risk. And that's something that we have to be careful about. We have to keep that into account. And we also have to teach our youngsters that as they're growing up, that they have to look at things that way also. They can't just think about what makes me feel good now. That's not good enough. Next slide, please. So what do we owe our children? I hope we've made the case that what we owe our children, at the very least, is that we can give to them what we were blessed with, what we were taught. If we are to cut the ties with the knowledge that we were given by our ancestors, and we deny that to the next generation, we have done them a terrible disservice. Terrible disservice. And if we as parents do that, I don't know where else they're going to go. You want them to go to television to try to learn their ethical values from television? You want their ethical values to be fed to them by politicians?
Absolutely not.
You want them
Priests?
to learn their ethical values in the streets? Want them to learn it from gangs, perhaps? Because that's where a lot of kids are learning it today.
That's right. It's their family.
And what do you think is going to be the result of that? And who do you think has to intervene before the law is able? Because the law can't intervene until a crime literally is committed. The problem is that once the crime is committed, it's way too late to try to intervene. Because then it really is extremely difficult to deal with. In fact, my daughter happens to be a professional in family counseling, and she tells me that these values that we talk about, because I've discussed this with her, these values that we talk about actually are acquired by the age of 3.
Jack, I can't hear you.
By the age of 3. These values are acquired by the age of 3. How? How do children learn these values that they obviously can't understand by the age of 3? And the only way we can suggest is that they see their parents doing things, making choices, and that's how they learn. They mimic, they watch, and they remember. Even though 20 years later, 30 years later, you would think that at the age of 3, they didn't notice that. They didn't see. They were only 2 years old at the time when that happened. They couldn't have learned that. The truth is that apparently, according to those that have studied these things, that's exactly what the children are doing. They're learning. Even when you think they're not, even when they don't realize the import of what they're learning. So as parents, this is something we have to be cognizant of. That what we demonstrate to our children by the way we lead our lives is how we teach them what we were taught by our parents. And the next issue was how our children relate to us matters. As we referred to when we spoke about the commandment of honor thy father and thy mother, it's that relationship between parent and child, not just how we relate to the child, but also the relationship the child has to us. That matters. If the child doesn't have the right kind of relationship, and I will remind you again what we mean by right. When we say the right kind of relationship, we mean the relationship that will support their survival. So if the child doesn't have that kind of relationship with their parents, they won't learn what they need to learn. And when they don't learn what they need to learn to survive, guess what happens? They don't. And it's happening all around us. And we don't understand it. It's driving us nuts because we don't know what to do about it. And the truth is, it's really right before us.
Try.
Really right before us. Next slide, please. Okay, we mentioned the idea of you want these ethical values to be promulgated by the government, the politicians. I don't think so. I really don't think so.
I don't think you should be demeaning politicians, by the way.
Shall we take a vote?
No, you have no right to do that.
I'm not demeaning them. I'm just saying they're not qualified. They're not qualified.
Don't demean them.
No, they're not qualified.
They may be.
I am not demeaning them.
They may be.
What I'm saying is they're not qualified to be that source.
Who qualifies them?
No, they don't have the qualifications to be a source of ethical values. That's all I'm saying. I'm not putting them down in terms of being the government. You know, they do what they have to. But in terms, pardon me?
Go ahead.
But in terms of being the source, the source that we learn from, what our ethical values should be, I don't think you want government officials to be. And the Constitution doesn't give them that authority. It doesn't. It really doesn't. Religion. I have to say that historically, the religious institutions, and please don't get uncomfortable with this, we have to remember that the religious world, or the religious perspectives of the world, are very diverse. And there are many people who don't have any kind of religious identity. And ethical values are important to people from any religion, or even to people who don't have any religious identification. Everybody needs, in order to survive, needs access to a resource that will help them acquire and be able to teach ethical values to their children. Everybody has a right to that, a moral right to that, I can't see any justification for denying anybody that opportunity. However, historically, if you look at where has the structure, the social structure been to actually administer ethical value systems. When I say administer, I don't mean enforcing or that kind of thing. I'm talking more about things like education, formulation of ethical values, identification, defining ethical values. Good example, because this comes up in the course every time. The question of something like abortion comes along. I'm not going to start a whole discussion of abortion, so don't get excited. But the question of abortion comes along. And the question becomes, what should ethical values define about the subject of abortion? Now, I think anyone who follows the subject is aware that among the various religious perspectives, there is diversity, legitimate, intellectual, scholarly, theological diversity. And how should we deal with that? I mean, is one right and one wrong? Or is there only one correct view? The way, frankly, I feel when I teach this course, it's not a matter of only one view. There are legitimate variations intellectually and theologically that can be very rationally explained and respected. Doesn't mean that every religious person has to accept the view of every other religious person, but we must recognize that different religious perspectives have to be able to coexist. And the people who don't have any religious perspective, they have to be able to coexist too. So in a way, what we have to do is kind of create a marketplace of ideas where we can talk to each other, even though we disagree with each other. We might even politically try to influence each other, but in terms of making allowances, leaving room for other people to have different views on very difficult subjects, but at the same time recognize that the historical role of organized religion in terms of trying to grapple with subjects like that is a very important role. And one of the way I describe that, and I know people think it puts them down, but personally I don't think so. I don't look at it that way. I believe that historically religious institutions have served the role of administrators of the ethical values for their constituencies. That when a person doesn't understand the ramifications of a particular ethical choice that they have to make, they have to be able to go somewheres to consult, to discuss, to ask, to feel safe in going to someone who they can discuss it with and get some kind of an understanding. In some faiths, perhaps the way the faiths are structured, they may say, we're going to tell you what to do. But others, I think, will try to give you an understanding so that you could make the right choice. And these are different styles of doing this work that we're talking about. And even those different styles have to be respected. Because every time you deal with a different kind of community, you're dealing with dynamics that can influence the methods you feel will be most effective in communicating what you need to communicate to the individual. And sometimes you have to adjust, even within the same religious dogma, you have to shift gears and say, hey, because of the particular person we're dealing with here, in order to communicate with them, we have to be sensitive to what will be most effective in helping them make the right decision. Okay. Extended family. Extended family is extremely important because, let's be honest, not every parent is great at being an inculcator of smart ethical values. There are some people who might not be able to hack it. Does that mean that the children don't deserve a break? Does that mean that we give up on them? I don't think so. I don't think anybody who has any sensitivity would suggest, would say, tough luck. You just didn't have the right, you weren't born into the right family. Can't
Like a
be that.
dysfunctional family?
What's that?
You say like a dysfunctional
Yeah,
family?
yeah, exactly. Parent who's an alcoholic. Happens. And as a matter of fact, the scholars who talk about the commandment of honor thy father and thy mother will discuss the question of what do you do if the father or mother is an alcoholic? Does that mean you shouldn't honor them? And if you remember what I said before, that there's a whole discussion that's worth getting into when you talk about why does the text say honor rather than obey? And there it is. Even if the parent isn't at the IQ level that you think they should be, or they have an alcohol problem or a drug problem,
You still respect
we still honor them. And not for their sake,
it. Your sake.
for our sake. Because we must retain that relationship. And our children must see us retaining that relationship, even with an alcoholic father or a drug addict mother. Yes?
I was just thinking in that example, you could actually disobey them because you honor them. If they said, I want another drink, and you say no, you're disobeying them because you honor them.
I think the message truly
didn't hear
is
the question.
honor them.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't hear the question.
Go ahead, speak up.
I was just saying you could even actually disobey a parent because you honor them, and if they, just as a specific, just if they wanted a drink and you said, I don't think you should drink anymore, I'm not going to give you a drink, you're disobeying them because you honor them.
Yeah, that sometimes in order to honor them, you have to disobey. And that happens sometimes. And that is possible. That's
Happens
possible.
to me all the
Okay.
time.
Okay. So, what we do want to be able to count on the extended family to fill in the void where that void exists.
What about a school? If you have children that comes to the,
There's a problem with the schools. And that's why I tried to say before, that it's unfortunate that the schools are afraid or can't get involved in teaching ethics because it's too closely identified with religion. But there's also another issue. I think if you try to get into the mode where you're going to evaluate the credentials of a teacher to teach ethical values, where you don't have a handle on what their ethical values are in their own personal lives, I think you'll have trouble with the teachers' union at least. Because I don't think they'll let you do that. So what's going to happen is you're going to have teachers who will be teaching ethical values who you really may not want them to. And so what they've done is they said, okay, this is really in the realm of what the parents have to do, so we'll let them handle that. And I think in a way that's sad, because what we've done is we've thrown out the baby with the water. Okay? I think that we shouldn't have thrown out all ethical values, that somehow we have to find a way to bring some of that back into the schools. But you're right, the schools do have to provide, because when you have a school education, a school system that's totally devoid of an atmosphere of ethical values in the educational program, it's too sanitized. It's almost antiseptic, because that's not what real life is. It's not.
Quick question.
Yes.
Don't ethics come up in the study of, in social studies and history? Wouldn't that be a good time to?
Very limited.
You know, war, movements, peace,
I happen to agree with you.
Democrats, Republicans.
Absolutely, I agree with you. It should be.
Yeah.
But the
it's
schools,
clinical, it's
they're
sanitized.
so afraid of somehow being targeted with the idea of something to do with religion in the public schools. They say no.
Yeah.
Yes.
How can you not teach ethics? In
Right.
school,
Talk-
the
talk to-
child is taught to
talk-
be in school on time.
Okay.
Now, they don't necessarily.
All right, let me-
But, I mean, at the very minimum.
Let me give you an example, okay? One of the issues that we in the Union County Human Relations Commission got involved in very early in the game was the whole question of bullying in schools. Right after the Columbine incident, if you recall, we had several discussions about what are the issues involved and is there anything that we could do actually to respond to the problem. And I have to tell you that during some of the conversations we had, there were people who had responsibilities in the educational systems of Union County who made the statement that a certain amount of bullying is a normal part of growing up. So if you want to know how can we not talk about ethics, it's easy. It's easy. If it becomes too difficult to talk about it, people just don't. Yes, sir.
There is in the state of New Jersey a teaching tolerance curriculum that is mandated, and whether schools follow through on it is up to the administration of the schools. But there's a mandated curriculum on tolerance and basic values that it's in the primary school level.
But bullying was something that had to be taken care of, and the state did, by the way. But what the state mandated actually was that every school district had to come up with requirements, with some plan of and training in their districts for dealing with a bullying issue, and a lot of people felt that the state shouldn't have gotten involved in that. A lot of people in the education field really felt that they shouldn't have. And as a matter of fact, there was about a year ago, there was maybe even less, a case down in the shore area, I think at Tom's River or
LW
somewhere
versus Tom's
down
River
there,
Board of Education.
where a high school was sued by a family because their son was happened to be gay, but during